Partisan gerrymandering is clearly a big problem, and as we get the data from the most recent census, there's a lot of worries about how it will be used to continue the process. So it is a problem, but how do you fix it? One way that some states have gone about dealing with it is with independent redistricting commissions of one form or another, which are said to be less prone to partisan bias. But how does it actually work out in actual day-to-day action? We're gonna talk to someone now who's been looking into the way that one of these independent redistricting commissions works in Arizona. We're very lucky to be joined once again by senior reporter for the Center for Public Integrity, Carrie Levine. Welcome back to the Damage Report.
Thanks so much for having me. It's nice to be here.
We're glad to have you here. You had an article up recently about how this has been working. What are some of the things that you found?
Well, for one thing, we found that even the partisan forces are mobilizing to influence even the sort of early organizational decisions of Arizona's Independent Redistricting Commission. And I thought that was really interesting, even at a point in time before the data came out, when the commission was just deciding which consultants to hire, how to sort of make some early decisions. There was still that much influence and interest in influencing those decisions because people are hoping to ultimately shape the maps.
So when it is said to be independent, we understand that as meaning that you don't have clear partisan actors that are involved in the decisions, but obviously we're a political country. There's a lot at stake. It's hard to imagine many adults who'd be working in this field that don't have any preferences one way or another. So what does the word independent mean in practice? What sort of protections are there against bias in this process?
I think that's such a great question. And the answer is that, like so many things to do with politics, to do with voting, to do with elections and political power, the answer really varies by state. And so in Arizona, there's a process laid out, and Arizona voters adopted this commission via a constitutional referendum. They voted to have this process, right? And this is the third redistricting that's being done this way. There are ultimately 2 Democrats appointed to the commission, 2 Republicans, and an independent who's seen as a tiebreaker. And so in a lot of ways, that independent vote is a very influential one, because depending on who they vote with, that can be the decisive vote if there's a partisan difference over something. And so in other states, they set it up in slightly different ways. California's commission is somewhat larger. And so I think it really just depends. But I think a lot of people do have the view that you mentioned, that this is some sort of ivory tower kind of commission composed of people who have absolutely no political thoughts, feelings, or affiliations, who sprang fully formed from the head of Zeus. And that's not really how any of these are set up. All of these people come from somewhere, they have thoughts and ideas. Some of them belong to political parties and are there to represent them. But what the independent really refers to is this takes the power directly out of the hands of legislators. Legislators are not the people redrawing the political maps and deciding who their voters are going to be. And so that's really the goal of these commissions.
Now, you've talked a little bit about how some of this bias can creep in, but in your article, you also talk about accusations of bias that aren't necessarily quite accurate. The fact that it seems like there are groups that are providing talking points for regular citizens to bombard the commission with. Can you tell us about an example of that?
Yes. So in Arizona, as the independent redistricting consultant was preparing to hire a mapping consultant, they had bids from 3 different prospective mapping consultants. And during the public comment period, comments started pouring into the commission at a much greater rate than they had in the past. And over, you heard some of the same talking points. And 2 of the candidates for the contract had handled redistricting in the past for Arizona, or had ties to the companies that had handled redistricting in the past in Arizona, shared key executives, and so it was really interesting. But there were a lot of accusations echoed from comment to comment, sometimes in a cut and paste way, about how those companies had handled the process in the past, and also in some cases taking things out of context. So for instance, there was one campaign to say that one company who was competing for the contract was a, quote, Obama and Bernie data company. unquote, and that former President Barack Obama and Senator Bernie Sanders should have no say in Arizona redistricting, right? Mm-hmm. Well, they had been clients of the company. Which also does political data work, and so just because you hired that company didn't mean that suddenly former President Obama and Senator Sanders were going to be drawing the district lines for Arizona, right? That was not right, but it showed up over and over and over again in the comments submitting to the commission.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so like the idea is if the commission had an event and it was catered by Ben and Jerry's, I don't have control over it just because I've purchased a lot of Chubby Hubby. Like that isn't necessarily how it works. And imagine in the same way that I
find control over Ben and Jerry's though.
Exactly. It's hard to imagine an adult who doesn't have political preferences. Like when you say that, there's 2 spots for independence, I immediately question what that means in practice. But a political data organization is going to have had clients. Now, if they have a 30-year track record of only right-wing or left-wing candidates, then I don't know, but definitely context matters, but these are organizations that have worked in politics and that seems like it needs to be understood. But that begs the question, I'm curious, there are obviously different stakeholders based on the experiment, and you've now looked into this. By experiment, I mean they've been working at this for a bit. Do people seem satisfied? Are some groups satisfied and not others? How is it actually working out from the perspective of those who are involved in the process and those who have to work under it?
So I think that's a really interesting point. One thing I'm realizing, the more I learn about redistricting, the more that I looked into this is, it is really hard to find a situation where people come to consensus and say, oh yeah, this was great. They did a great job on these maps. There were independent analyses of Arizona's maps from the last redistricting cycle that found that they were less, among the least skewed of the states. They actually found that the last redistricting commission did a good job. And so that said, the last redistricting commission came under heavy fire. There was a lot of litigation over those maps, and they stood the test. The courts said that they were fair maps. The Department of Justice pre-cleared those maps. That was when Arizona had to seek approval from the Department of Justice for its redistricting maps, which is no longer the case. But those maps stood up, and so I think it's really interesting because there are definitely people who say, no, those maps were terrible. That process was terrible. That commission was biased. And so I think what you see is the political stakes in this are very, very high. And the upshot of it is that even though the accusation is that those maps were skewed towards Democrats, both the congressional delegation and the state legislature have been very closely divided. It's a very competitive state.
Okay. And finally, based on your research, I don't know to what extent you've been following the discussion or details around the For the People Act, but one component of that would be setting up these sorts of independent redistricting commissions. I don't know how detailed those plans are at this point, so a lot of this might be speculation, but when you hear about the possibility of something like that passing, based on what you've seen in Arizona, what are your thoughts about it being applied throughout the country?
I think that the real question would be, do people have a realistic view of what it means? Because again, when you say independent commission to people, they all have their own ideas about what that means. And someone's going to have to decide who's going to be on that commission, what it's going to look like, and how those decisions are going to get made. And if there's one thing I've learned about redistricting, it's that not everyone is going to agree with that. So just because you set up an independent commission, I think what that means is you're deciding they'll do a better job than legislators at drawing these districts because they don't have as direct a self-interest. But I think everyone's going to have to be very clear on what that looks like and be prepared for a little fuss and fury.
Well, if you're watching this and you want more details, Carrie's work is available at the Center for Public Integrity. Carrie Levine, I want to thank you for joining us today and breaking down your work.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
Check out the Damage Report podcast each day, wherever you get your podcasts, whether Pocket Casts or Stitcher or iTunes. You can join me as I give you the news and stories you want, with a range of co-hosts and interview guests jumping in on the fun each day. Again, that's the Damage Report, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you get them at iTunes, don't forget to rate and review. Sometimes I'll read them live on the show.